Dr. Robert Hendricks is 51 years old, chief of surgery at Memorial Medical Center in Chicago, a man whose career has been built on precision, rationality, and unwavering commitment to scientific method over superstition or religious interpretation of medical phenomena. He's performed thousands of surgeries over 27 years, addressed complications ranging from routine to catastrophic, maintained composure and clinical detachment that his colleagues admire and his patients trust. But nothing in his extensive experience has prepared him for the case currently occupying Operating Room 3. The patient whose condition has generated more controversy within the hospital than any medical situation Robert has encountered in his entire career. The patient is Daniel Reeves, a 26-year-old graduate student in physics whose crescent moon mark appeared on his right palm 6 months ago. The pale silver marking approximately 1 inch long, glowing faintly in darkness, defying every medical test and diagnostic procedure that Memorial specialists have attempted. Daniel sought medical attention, not because the mark causes pain or dysfunction, but because it's made his life impossible. He's been expelled from his university program after religious students accused him of blasphemy or demonic possession. He's lost his apartment after his landlord decided housing someone marked by supernatural forces created liability risks. He's been harassed by both religious zealots who believe he's prophet or demon, and by skeptics who believe he's perpetrating elaborate hoax. Daniel doesn't want to be marked, doesn't believe in God or supernatural explanations, views the mark as biological anomaly that medical science should be capable of removing just as it removes tumors or repairs damaged tissue. He's tried everything. Dermatologists who attempted laser removal only to watch the mark reappear within hours. Plastic surgeons who excised the marked tissue only to see the crescent reform on the surgical scar. Even experimental treatments involving radiation and chemical agents that had no effect beyond causing standard tissue damage that healed normally while the mark persisted unchanged. Dr. Hendricks took Daniel's case after other physicians refused, their reluctance based partly on medical uncertainty about how to address phenomenon that doesn't respond to conventional treatments, and partly on superstitious fear about interfering with divine will if the mark actually represents supernatural rather than natural occurrence. Robert views such concerns as embarrassing capitulation to magical thinking, insists that every phenomenon has natural explanation regardless of how unusual it appears, believes that his responsibility as physician is addressing his patient's suffering rather than respecting other people's religious interpretations of that suffering. If you're watching this video, drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. The surgery Robert has planned is aggressive and comprehensive. Complete removal of the marked tissue from Daniel's palm, extending deep enough to eliminate any cellular structures that might contain whatever mechanism causes the mark to regenerate, followed by skin grafting to cover the excised area. The procedure carries significant risks, including permanent nerve damage, loss of hand function, and chronic pain. But Daniel has consented enthusiastically, willing to accept these consequences if the surgery eliminates the mark that's destroyed his normal life. What Daniel doesn't know, what Robert has carefully avoided disclosing, is that the hospital administration has ordered the surgery to be filmed. The video intended for medical documentation and research, but also for protecting the hospital legally, if the procedure generates controversy or litigation. The filming is technically within the broad consent forms Daniel signed, but Robert recognizes that explicitly telling Daniel his surgery will be recorded might cause him to refuse or to question the hospital's motives in ways that could complicate the already controversial procedure. The surgical team assembles at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late November, the pre-dawn darkness outside matching the tension inside OR3. Robert's team includes Dr. Sarah Kim, an anesthesiologist whose technical skill is matched by her deep Catholic faith and her vocal discomfort with this surgery. Dr. James Martinez, a surgical resident who views the procedure as fascinating medical challenge rather than as ethically complicated intervention. And 3 nurses whose opinions about removing the mark range from supportive to deeply opposed, but whose professionalism ensures they'll assist competently regardless of their personal views. The cameras are positioned discreetly, one overhead capturing the surgical field, one focused on the monitoring equipment, one providing wide angle of the entire operating room. Robert insisted that the filming be as unobtrusive as possible, not wanting the surgical team distracted by awareness that they are being recorded, not wanting Daniel to wake during the procedure and see cameras that might make him feel like specimen being studied rather than patient being treated. Daniel is brought into the OR at 6:30, his right hand already prepped and marked, his face showing mixture of hope and anxiety that Robert recognizes from decades of pre-surgical interactions. Sarah administers the anesthesia, her voice gentle as she tells Daniel to count backward from 100, her face troubled as she monitors his descent into unconsciousness. Once Daniel is fully under, Robert performs final check of the surgical plan, confirms that everyone understands their roles, begins the procedure that will either eliminate Daniel's mark or confirm that whatever creates it is beyond current medical intervention's capacity to address. The initial incision is unremarkable. Robert's scalpel cuts through Daniel's skin following the marked area, the tissue responding normally to the blade, bleeding as expected, showing no immediate indication that this is anything other than standard surgical excision. Robert works methodically, extending the incision deeper, exposing the underlying fascia and muscle tissue, searching for any abnormality that might explain the mark's presence and persistence. But as Robert reaches the deeper tissue layers, something changes. The marked tissue begins glowing more brightly, the pale silver luminescence intensifying under the surgical lights, the effect visible enough that everyone in the OR notices and exchanges concerned glances. Robert pauses, his training and his rationalist worldview insisting that this must be explainable through natural phenomena. Perhaps the trauma of surgery is triggering bioluminescent reaction in whatever cells contain the marking. Perhaps the anesthesia or the surgical environment is interacting with the mark's biochemistry in unexpected ways. Sarah's voice comes from behind her anesthesia station, tight with concern. Dr. Hendricks, the monitors are showing something unusual. Robert looks up from the surgical field, his attention shifting to the array of screens displaying Daniel's vital signs. The heart rate monitor shows normal sinus rhythm, but the waveform is behaving strangely. Instead of the standard irregular peaks and valleys of cardiac electrical activity, the pattern is becoming more regular, more geometric. The peaks forming pattern that looks less like biological rhythm and more like deliberate signal. The pulse oximeter display is changing too, its standard numerical readings flickering and reforming into symbols that Robert doesn't recognize. Characters that look vaguely like ancient writing or mathematical notation, but that don't correspond to any language or symbolic system he's familiar with. The blood pressure monitor's screen is displaying image rather than numbers. A crescent moon, pale silver like Daniel's mark, rotating slowly against the black background where pressure readings should appear. James suggests they stop the procedure, that whatever's happening is beyond normal surgical complications and requires reassessment. But Robert refuses, his voice carrying authority that brooks no argument. This is equipment malfunction, nothing more. The electromagnetic fields from the surgical instruments are interfering with the monitors. We continue the procedure. Focus on the patient, not on malfunctioning screens. But even as Robert speaks, he recognizes that his explanation is inadequate. That equipment malfunction doesn't account for the coordinated changes across multiple independent monitoring systems, that the symbols appearing on the screens look too deliberate and too meaningful to be random electronic errors. Still, admitting that something genuinely inexplicable is occurring would mean acknowledging that his rationalist framework might be insufficient. That Daniel's mark might be something that medical science cannot address through standard interventions. Robert continues the excision, removing larger section of tissue than originally planned, determined to eliminate any cellular structures that could regenerate the mark. The removed tissue is placed in specimen container, still glowing faintly, the silver luminescence visible even in the surgical light's brightness. Robert examines the exposed deeper tissue, finding nothing obviously abnormal beyond the persistent glow, no tumors or unusual structures that might explain the phenomenon. The grafting procedure begins. Robert and James working to cover the excised area with skin harvested from Daniel's thigh. The surgical technique flawless and routine despite the increasingly bizarre behavior of the monitoring equipment. The heart monitor's waveform has transformed completely now, no longer showing cardiac rhythm but displaying what looks unmistakably like text. Words forming in English across the screen. "You cannot remove what I have placed." Sarah gasps audibly, her Catholic faith making her interpret this message as literally divine communication, as God speaking through the medical equipment to warn them that their surgery is violating sacred will. She suggests again that they stop, that continuing is dangerous, not just medically, but spiritually. Robert ignores her, his focus remaining on the surgical field, his hands steady despite his racing heart and the cold sweat forming beneath his surgical gown. But the messages continue appearing across the monitors, each screen displaying different text. The mark is not diseased to be cured. The chosen cannot become unchosen through human intervention. What has been sealed cannot be unsealed by mortal hands. The words appear in English, clear and undeniable, their source impossible to explain through equipment malfunction or electromagnetic interference. The audio monitoring equipment begins emitting sound, not the standard beeps and alarms of medical devices, but something else. A resonant tone that fills the operating room with vibration that everyone feels in their bones. The sound grows louder, developing harmonics and complexity, becoming less like random noise and more like voice, deep and vast and speaking in language that Robert doesn't understand, but that Sarah apparently does because she's crying now. Her voice shaking as she translates. It's Aramaic. It's saying, "I have marked this one for purposes you cannot comprehend. Your surgery is futile. The mark will return because I will it to return." Robert wants to dismiss this as Sarah's religious hysteria, as her interpretation of random sounds through lens of her faith. But the voice is undeniable. Its reality evident to everyone in the OR, the words, whether Aramaic or something else, carrying authority and presence that makes arguing about their source feel absurd. This is either elaborate hoax that Robert can't explain, or it's exactly what it appears to be. Divine communication, God speaking through medical equipment, responding directly to their attempt to remove Daniel's mark. The surgery continues, Robert's hands working automatically while his mind struggles to process what's happening. The skin graft is secured, the incisions closed, the procedure completed according to plan, despite the supernatural chaos occurring around them. Daniel's vital signs remain stable throughout, his body responding normally to the surgery, even as the equipment monitoring him displays impossible messages and emits voices that shouldn't exist. As Robert removes his hands from the surgical field, preparing to close and conclude the operation, the marking on Daniel's palm, which should be eliminated, should be covered by the skin graft, begins glowing through the surgical dressing, its silver light visible and intensifying. The crescent moon shape clearly defined despite being buried beneath layers of surgical gauze and transplanted tissue. Robert cuts away the dressing, exposing the surgical site, his clinical composure finally cracking as he sees what everyone in the OR is witnessing. The mark has returned, appearing on the grafted skin itself. Not just returned, but enhanced. The crescent moon is larger now, more defined, glowing more brightly than before the surgery. The excision and grafting accomplished nothing except making the mark more prominent, proving exactly what the messages claimed: that removing what God has placed is impossible through human intervention. The operating room descends into chaos as the mark's intensified glow illuminates the entire space, casting silver shadows across the walls and ceiling. Sarah backs away from her anesthesia station, her hands trembling as she crosses herself repeatedly, her faith and her medical training colliding in ways that leave her paralyzed between professional duty and religious terror. James stands frozen, his rational skepticism shattered by the undeniable evidence that something beyond natural explanation is occurring. The nurses hover uncertainly, torn between their responsibility to assist and their instinct to flee from phenomenon that violates everything they understand about how reality operates. Robert forces himself to maintain composure, his voice sharp as he orders the team to complete the standard post-operative procedures, securing the surgical site, ensuring Daniel's vital signs remain stable, preparing him for transfer to recovery. But even as Robert issues these commands, his mind is reeling from the implications of what just occurred. The mark returned instantly, proving that whatever mechanism creates it operates beyond biological processes that surgery can interrupt. The messages and the voice demonstrated intelligence and intentionality that equipment malfunction cannot explain. The evidence suggests that Sarah's interpretation is correct, that they've just witnessed divine intervention, that God has responded directly to their attempt to remove the mark. The monitoring equipment begins returning to normal function, the messages fading from the screens, the waveforms resuming standard cardiac patterns, the voice diminishing until only the usual surgical sounds remain. But the mark on Daniel's palm continues glowing intensely, its brightness slowly diminishing but remaining far more luminous than before the surgery. The transformation is permanent. The attempt to remove the mark has made it more prominent rather than eliminating it, has amplified rather than diminished whatever divine purpose it represents. Daniel begins waking from anesthesia as the team transfers him to recovery, his consciousness returning gradually, his first awareness being the burning sensation in his right palm. He opens his eyes to see Robert standing beside him, the surgeon's face showing exhaustion and something else. Fear, uncertainty, emotions that Daniel has never seen in the confident physician who promised to eliminate the mark that had destroyed his normal life. Robert tells Daniel what happened, his clinical language inadequate for describing the supernatural events, but his honesty unflinching. The surgery was completed as planned. The marked tissue was removed. The skin graft was performed perfectly. But the mark returned immediately, appearing on the grafted skin, larger and brighter than before. The monitoring equipment displayed messages claiming divine origin, warning that the mark cannot be removed by human intervention, speaking in ancient languages about purposes beyond human comprehension. Daniel's response is denial and anger. He doesn't believe in God, doesn't accept supernatural explanations, insists that Robert is lying or mistaken, or that equipment malfunction created illusions the surgical team misinterpreted through their religious biases. But when Daniel looks at his bandaged hand and sees the silver light glowing through the surgical dressing, when nurses reluctantly confirm Robert's account of the messages and the voice, his denial begins crumbling under the weight of evidence that his rationalist worldview cannot accommodate. Sarah approaches Daniel's bedside, her Catholic faith giving her framework for interpreting what occurred that Daniel lacks. She tells him gently that the mark is divine sign, that God has chosen him for purposes that neither medical science nor human understanding can fully grasp, that attempting to remove it was like trying to erase divine will itself. She suggests that Daniel should seek religious guidance rather than medical intervention, that accepting his marking might bring peace, that fighting it has prevented. But Daniel rejects this interpretation violently, his voice rising despite his post-anesthesia weakness. "I don't want to be chosen. I didn't ask for this mark. I don't believe in your God or in divine purposes. This is my body, my life, and I have the right to remove things from it, regardless of what superstitious people think they mean." His outburst triggers monitoring alarms, his heart rate and blood pressure spiking, forcing Sarah to administer sedatives that return him to unconsciousness, while the medical team stabilizes his vitals. The surgical video recorded everything. The glowing mark, the messages appearing across monitors, the voice emerging from audio equipment. The marks return despite successful excision and grafting. The footage is reviewed by hospital administration within hours of the surgery's completion, their response immediate and alarmed. What was supposed to be routine documentation of experimental procedure has become evidence of either impossible supernatural event or elaborate hoax that will destroy Memorial Medical Center's reputation, regardless of which explanation is correct. The hospital's legal team seizes the video, ordering that all copies be secured and that no one involved discusses the surgery publicly. They're consulting with experts to determine whether the footage shows genuine supernatural occurrence or whether it can be explained through equipment malfunction, camera artifacts, or coordinated deception by the surgical team. But the experts they consult are divided. Technical specialists insist the video must be fabricated because the displayed phenomena are physically impossible, while religious scholars argue the footage shows authentic divine intervention consistent with historical accounts of God communicating through signs and wonders. The attempted cover-up fails within 48 hours when James, the surgical resident whose faith in scientific rationalism was shattered by what he witnessed, copies the video and uploads it to multiple online platforms before the hospital can prevent him. His accompanying statement explains that he's sharing the footage because the public deserves to know that divine intervention is real, that God has demonstrated his existence and his power through undeniable miracle, that the evidence should not be hidden to protect institutional reputations or to preserve comfortable atheistic assumptions about reality. The video goes viral instantly, accumulating millions of views within hours, generating worldwide attention from media, religious organizations, skeptical groups, and scientific institutions. The footage is analyzed frame by frame, the messages transcribed and translated, the voice studied by linguists and audio specialists. The debate becomes immediate and polarized. Religious believers see confirmation of faith. Skeptics insist on fraud or malfunction. Scientists struggle to explain phenomena that violate established physical laws. Daniel becomes international figure overnight, despite remaining sedated in Memorial's recovery ward. Religious groups declare him prophet or chosen vessel, demand access to him for spiritual guidance. Skeptical organizations insist he's complicit in hoax, demand investigations into how the deception was accomplished. Media requests for interviews number in the thousands, crowds gathering outside the hospital, hoping to see the marked man whose surgery apparently triggered divine response. Robert faces professional catastrophe as the surgical video spreads. Medical boards launch investigations into whether he violated ethical standards by attempting to remove marking that might have religious significance. Religious groups file complaints accusing him of blasphemy or of interfering with divine will. His colleagues divide between those who support his scientific approach and those who believe he should have recognized the mark's supernatural nature and refused the surgery. The mark itself continues changing. Each day it grows slightly larger, its glow intensifies. Its appearance becomes more elaborate with additional details and symbols appearing within the crescent shape. Daniel, now conscious and confronting the reality that his attempt to remove the mark has made it impossible to ignore, faces choice between accepting what appears to be divine selection or continuing to fight against phenomenon that surgery proved cannot be removed through human means. The footage's final frames show the monitoring equipment displaying one last message before returning to normal function. The marked one will choose. Acceptance brings purpose. Rejection brings only suffering. But the choice remains his, as it has always been. The words suggest that Daniel's free will is preserved despite the marking, that God is not forcing him to accept his selection, but that fighting divine purpose creates pain while accepting it offers meaning that Daniel's rationalist worldview cannot provide. 3 months after the surgery, the world remains divided by the leaked footage. No consensus has emerged. 40% believe it shows authentic divine intervention, 40% insist it's elaborate hoax, and 20% remain uncertain. Daniel has become the most famous and controversial person on Earth. His life transformed into a reluctant symbol of humanity's oldest debate about God's existence. The mark has continued evolving, now covering Daniel's entire hand in intricate silver patterns that pulse with his heartbeat. The crescent moon surrounded by symbols religious scholars identify as corresponding to sacred texts from multiple faiths: Hebrew, Arabic, Sanskrit, ancient Greek. The marking glows visibly even in daylight, impossible to ignore or conceal. Dr. Robert Hendrick's career survived but was fundamentally altered. He's been cleared of ethical violations, but his reputation is permanently complicated. He's become reluctant expert on medical questions surrounding divine marks, invited to conferences to discuss phenomenon he still doesn't fully understand. Sarah Kim left Memorial. Her Catholic faith strengthened, but her confidence in medicine's ability to address supernatural phenomena shattered. She visits Daniel regularly, their conversations exploring whether accepting his marking might bring peace that fighting it has prevented. James Martinez, who leaked the video, was fired but became celebrated among religious communities. He abandoned medical training to become evangelist, sharing testimony about witnessing divine intervention. Daniel faces the choice the final message predicted: acceptance or continued rejection. For 3 months he maintained his atheistic stance, but the mark's evolution, the surgery's failure, and his inability to live normally have worn down his resistance. Sarah's visits become turning point. She asks Daniel to consider whether his suffering comes not from being marked, but from fighting what it represents. The message offered choice. Acceptance brings purpose, rejection brings suffering. His current misery stems from choosing suffering through rejection. Daniel begins researching marked individuals throughout history. Those who accepted their markings lived meaningful lives despite challenges. Those who rejected experienced increasing suffering, isolation, and early deaths that religious traditions attributed to refusing divine calling. The choice crystallizes when 9-year-old girl dying from cancer asks if Daniel can heal her. His initial response is explaining he has no healing powers. But her desperate hope breaks his resistance. He realizes his rejection isn't just affecting him, but denying whatever purpose the mark was meant to serve. Daniel places his marked hand on her head, speaking words that come from somewhere else, prayers in languages he doesn't know. He asks, despite his atheism, that if there is a God, and if this mark means anything, please let this child be healed. The Azkahor girl's cancer enters complete remission within 48 hours, her tumors disappearing inexplicably. Medical tests confirm she's cancer-free. Daniel cannot dismiss this as coincidence. The timing is too precise, the healing too complete. The evidence forces acknowledgement. The mark represents something real. Divine purpose exists regardless of his beliefs. His choice is not whether the supernatural is real, but whether he'll participate in what it's offering. Acceptance doesn't come easily. Daniel remains skeptical by nature, struggles with theological questions. But he stops fighting the marking, begins exploring what acceptance means practically. He starts meeting people who seek him out, discovering that sometimes people are healed and sometimes they're not. But his presence provides meaning even when miracles don't occur. The transformation is gradual but profound. Daniel's suffering diminishes as he accepts his marking's purpose. He doesn't become conventionally religious, doesn't claim to understand God's nature. But he acknowledges something beyond natural explanation has marked him. That accepting rather than rejecting has brought the purpose and peace the message promised. 6 months after surgery, Daniel gives his first public statement to hundreds of millions. He speaks honestly about his journey from rejection to reluctant acceptance, about evidence that forced him to reconsider his atheism, about healings his marked hand enables. He doesn't have all answers, but has learned that fighting divine purpose creates suffering while accepting it, even imperfectly. Opens possibilities rationalism alone cannot access. Daniel addresses skeptics. I understand your skepticism. I was the most skeptical person imaginable. But consider what the evidence actually shows rather than what your worldview allows you to accept. The surgery failed. The mark returned larger. The messages were real, recorded by multiple systems, witnessed by trained professionals, documented in footage experts haven't explained through natural means. At some point, denial becomes more irrational than acceptance. The leaked video remains most watched footage in history, its influence extending beyond religious debate into medicine, science, philosophy, and culture. Medical schools teach courses examining its implications. Religious institutions use it as evidence for divine intervention. Scientific organizations struggle to explain phenomena violating established physical laws. Robert watches Daniel's interview from his office, his rationalist worldview permanently complicated. He cannot accept supernatural explanations comfortably, but also cannot dismiss what the monitoring equipment displayed, what the video documented. Robert's published assessment concludes with unusual humility. The Daniel Reeves surgery demonstrates limits of medical intervention when confronting phenomena operating outside natural law. Our attempt to remove the mark not only failed but amplified it, suggesting some conditions should not be treated as diseases, but as realities to be accepted on their own terms. Medicine cannot address everything, and acknowledging this is not abandoning science, but recognizing its appropriate scope. They recorded a surgery to remove the mark, and God's own voice appeared on the monitors, warning that what has been divinely placed cannot be removed by human hands. The surgery failed. The mark returned larger. The leaked video shocked the world. Daniel learned that fighting divine purpose creates suffering while accepting it, even imperfectly. Opens possibilities rationalism alone cannot access. That being chosen means surrendering control while gaining meaning nothing else provides. The world remains divided, but the evidence documented in Operating Room 3 continues forcing humanity to confront questions about divine intervention that comfortable secularism had declared settled.